Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining and spending the next hour or so with us. I am pumped for this conversation on defining, understanding your ideal rep profile or IRP. I think we've all heard so much about, setting up your customer profile. So this concept of the ideal rep profile is just not as common, but it should be. And so I'm very excited to dive into that, better understand the skills and competencies of top performing reps. And we have got an incredible panel of experts from Drift, from Outreach, and Indeed to have this conversation. So I will get out of the way shortly, but we're going to give folks just a few more minutes to roll in. So if you've just joined, go ahead and open up your chat and let us know that you're here. Tell us your name, your role, where you're tuning in from. And if you'd like, share your LinkedIn link. So be sure to connect with the other folks who are joining today. If you have a question during this session, please use our Q&A box. And we want your questions. We want this to be interactive. So take advantage of being here live. And with that, Alex Salop, Director of Product Marketing at MindTickle, is going to be facilitating this discussion. So, Alex, thank you so much for hosting this conversation. I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself, the topic, and the guests that we have here with us.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Alex Salop. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at MindTickle, and I really appreciate you folks all being here with us. The topic of today's conversation is tying readiness to revenue and defining your ideal rep profile. And so that's what we're going to be getting into in a second. And as Sam mentioned, I'm joined by three esteemed panel members. First, for a little background on myself, as Sam mentioned, I'm Director of Product Marketing here at MindTickle. I've been in this business for close to about 15 years, so I've been around it quite a bit. And the sales enablement space has undergone some pretty significant changes in that period of time, as you'd expect, and particularly in the recent past. And I know at MindTickle we've seen some great things happening. And so this is a really opportune time to talk about this concept of the ideal rep profile. So what I'd like to do is just introduce the other panelists and have them just take an opportunity to tell us more about themselves. I'll start with Brooke Bachesta, who's the XDR Enablement Manager at Outreach. Brooke, take it away.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Like Alex mentioned, my name's Brooke Bachesta. I lead global enablement for our XDR team at Outreach. So that's about 100 people, including managers, the inbound team, and the outbound team. In my past life, prior to getting into enablement, I led SDR teams for about 4.5 years. So it's very near and dear to my heart. I've been an SDR a couple times before and an AE. I'm super excited to be joined on this panel with all these amazing folks here today.
Great, thank you so much, Brooke. Next up is Ross Schenk, who's Director of Shinnick. See, I got it wrong, Ross, I'm sorry. Ross Shinnick, who's Director of Sales at Indeed. Ross, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, my name is Ross. I'm a Director of Sales at Indeed. Been in sales for about 5 years. I was extremely excited to just be on this because of what the topic is, this idea of the rep profile and understanding that there's just this pattern of competencies and skills that top performers in sales are just doing differently than underperformers or people who perform average. So, I spent the last few years doing research on this topic and have been communicating some of these ideas to other people at Indeed and elsewhere. So excited to talk about this.
That's awesome, Ross, and we look forward to hearing for your input and all the panelists' input. And then Brooke Friedman, who's the Senior Director of Sales for Mid-Markets at Drift. Brooke, please introduce yourself.
Hi, it's awesome to be here. I do direct part of our sales org at Drift. I run the mid-market segment, AEs specifically. What else is there to know? I've been in sales my entire career. I'm a self-admitted sales geek, and I love talking about this stuff. Before I was at Drift, I ran sales teams at both Litmus and HubSpot. So been in tech for quite some time and was in media ad sales for many years before that. So happy to have this conversation today and learn a little bit from the other panelists and the audience joining us too. So thanks for having me, Alex.
Awesome. Well, I also have a long career in sales before I went into product marketing. So hopefully I can keep up with you guys as best as possible. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and get things going right about now. I just have to get the presentation up so you can see that. All right, you guys can see the presentation? Yes? Cool, that's a great start. So let's talk about tying readiness to revenue and the ideal rep profile. And the first place I want to start is talking about what sales readiness is, because I think it's a great way to sort of define what we're talking about here today. So first of all, sales readiness is a continuous state of excellence to grow revenue by using a suite of tools and processes to increase knowledge, enhance performance, and adapt to change. Now, some people, I think, over time have conflated or used sales readiness as a synonym with sales enablement, but it's really a vastly different thing. Sales enablement is actually a part of a comprehensive readiness approach, and a readiness approach includes 5 steps or phases. The first one is defining excellence. That is, what does good look like? What's the best practice? What are the attributes of the salesperson who's really successful in my organization, so that I can start building sales teams around those attributes? And then the next step is the traditional enablement aspect of things, building knowledge, the training, practice, and reinforcement that you need to do to create that skill set so that you can emulate those behaviors that win deals. And then for that just-in-time content, to align content to that track of what's of success with just-in-time training content and content that can be shared with buyers. And then when sales reps are in the field, analyzing real-world performance. How do they do during their live sales interactions to see if they're adhering to those concepts that win deals. And then finally, providing customized remediation to optimize behavior, either through individualized coaching or training. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about sales readiness. We're going to focus a lot of our conversation today on that first step, though, defining excellence and the ideal rep profile. So the reality is that in most organizations, unfortunately, sales teams are not hitting quota. This research that was from the new Sales Enablement Standard Benchmark report done in 2021 shows that only about 15% of sales teams are hitting quota, and really about 2/3 are coming up short at around 75%. So obviously that's a problem, and we have to figure out a way where we can take those behaviors of our top reps and spread them across the team so more people are able to hit their number. So my first question for the panel is, in your opinion, is sales readiness just a pipe dream, or can revenue organizations actually achieve it? And just to kick off the conversation, I'll ask Brooke to tell us what you think, and then maybe other people can chime in and we can talk about it.
So yeah, I think sales readiness is totally a reasonable thing to set out there in the universe, and it should inform the way that, like, anytime you launch a program, like starting with the end in mind, right? Like launching training just for the sake of training's sake makes a lot more work for us in the end. So I think if you're starting with future state of like, hey, I know that I need people to be able to execute this script or make this change, it just helps with your maturity modeling and like your work back plan from the get-go.
That makes a lot of sense. And Brooke Friedman, what are your thoughts?
I definitely believe in it. I don't think it's a pipe dream at all. I've seen it work in practice for sure, but I think it requires some connectedness between onboarding and enablement, regular coaching, sales funnel management, and then all tying back to the recruitment and hiring process. But I do believe it is possible.
And then Ross, finally, what are your thoughts about it?
Yep, agreed. I think you need to have a lot of things working in your favor for your culture and your team and your organization. I think one of the most important components, if we're talking about sort of repeatable, scalable success, is culture, and making sure that you have teams and you have reps that actually want to be there and want to sell and want to learn and want to grow. I think you can have the perfect process, but if you don't have people working for you that want to execute, then you're not going to be able to get there. So I think when we're talking about just from a vision standpoint, is something like this possible? It certainly is, but you need a lot of different components. I think culture being one of the biggest ones.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm curious, having been in sales for a while, all of you, Do you think that this is closer to a reality today than it was a few years ago? I mean, I don't really think, it's interesting. I've seen the concept of measuring sales performance, especially from an enablement perspective, as for a long time, sales was an art, and people were successful, and the only thing you can do is hire. Do you think that there's more that you can do now to get past this pipe dream state for a lot of organizations?
Yeah, I think like if you look at how well resourced sales teams are today, like it is vastly different than before from a tech stack perspective, but even from a partnership perspective. So like enablement is growing. The fact that I get to work with just the XDRs, I feel like that's a pretty new motion, and because typically there's like the one enablement person for the entire go-to-market org. So yeah, I think there's a lot more resources at people's fingertips, which is just helpful. Like to Ross's point about culture, it gives you tools so you can have some self-awareness around like what does make our top performers tick, and like how can I copy paste this moving forward.
Gotcha. Well, we have the results back from the poll that we conducted as we were asking the question, and the answer is that most people agree that no, sales readiness is not just a pipe dream. So that's certainly good news in terms of what people can expect from their enablement efforts and how they can get salespeople ready to sell. So that's pretty exciting. So why don't I move on and move on to the next slide? So I'm going to share my screen again. Unfortunately, I have to go through a slight process in order to get my slides back up. So just give me 1 sec here, folks. So, sales success, I think the reason why, and I think we talked about this a little bit, is that it's not a pipe dream because, you start thinking about the culture and the kind of organization you're going to have in order to achieve the level of readiness that you want to. And one way that is really important to do this is to start identifying what those knowledge, skills, and behaviors are. Every organization has some really successful salespeople that if you put them in the corner and said, what is it about you that makes you successful? They might define a few of the attributes they think that make them successful. But many successful salespeople have unconscious competencies that by themselves are very difficult to measure. So there's got to be some other way than just saying, hey, be like Ross or be like Brooke, in order for them to be successful. And so you've got to figure out what are those attributes that success breeds, or that knowledge, skill, and behavior. So my next question for the panel, which is, what are, in your opinion, the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that make your top sales performers successful at your organization? And I will stop sharing so you can all see each other. And I think, Ross, you have an answer to this one from your perspective.
Sure. So yeah, I think we hear, if you read about this or if you watch videos on this, you'll see a lot of the same answers, and there's a lot of ways that you can tackle this kind of problem for your organization. I want to just hone in specifically on skills for a minute, because one of the biggest things that I think sales managers should be doing is looking at the mechanics and looking at the process of the actual sales call itself. So what is the rep saying? How are they responding to certain objections? What is their process for going about the pitch? And what I found is that there are some key differentiators between some of these top performers and some people who are just essentially struggling and scraping by and just anything they can do to get to quota. So I want to touch on two. The first one is they do an unbelievable job at asking relevant follow-up needs analysis questions. So when they're at the beginning of that demo and before they go into any sort of pitch, they obviously want to get the big picture. They want to be asking questions and they want to form an idea of the client's challenges and pain points or aspirations for their company. But oftentimes what you'll see is reps will ask questions as though it's an interview. Like they'll ask one question and then it's as if they're reading off a sheet. And sometimes they are reading off a sheet, and the client can feel that. And that has a serious negative impact. In one way, it ruins the rapport, right? The client feels like they're not genuinely there to help them. And the second one is it doesn't dig deep enough into some of the challenges that client is facing. And so you need to ask relevant follow-up questions with a mindset of being curious about the big picture. So we can go into more detail on that later, but that's one of the biggest ones. The second one is that they're very solution oriented. They talk a lot less about the features and what a particular product can offer. And so one of the big things I like to say is it's not what the product is, it's what the product can do for the client. And when they're going about their pitch, what you'll notice about top performers is they almost barely talk about the product itself. And if you're a sales manager on this call, you can do a quick litmus test on this with your reps. Have them try and sell you on your product without actually talking about the product, and just in terms of what the outcome should be. And if they do a good job at that, then you'll probably see them move up and to the right on your dashboard. For those of them that just can't get away from these features and talking about what they are, that's a serious area of improvement for them. But those are two of the big trends.
So Ross, did you see The Wolf of Wall Street?
I did.
Sell me this pen.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And they all fall for it.
Right. No, that's a really good point. And it's so difficult sometimes, reps talk about, imparting value and talking about solutions. But often they get into a very rote discussion where they're asking a list of questions. It's sort of like when you watch that interview at the end of the basketball game, and you can tell that the reporter just had a series of questions that we're asking and they aren't related to each other. It's like, couldn't you make that a little bit more personal? So what do you guys think? The two Brooks or what are some of the skills, the knowledge, skills, and behaviors you look for?
I can chime in on that. Done a lot of thinking about it actually over time. And I sort of think about like traits and then skills and competencies. And the traits that we're looking for, and I've actually seen common threads across organizations with a lot of these, are sort of like the first test against, okay, could we bring them in and teach them the rest? And so I'll sort of share what's on my list, and I'd love to hear what you all think about it. But at the top of the list is curiosity and the ability to actively listen. And usually like some good business acumen comes with this. And then to go back to your point, Ross, on that, those kinds of reps aren't going to go down a list of questions and ask questions that aren't connected, because they're genuinely trying to think about how the prospect's business or customer's business works, right? So that's the top one, is curiosity. The second is coachability, and the ability for a rep to absorb feedback and then put it into practice. And that's kind of like the test for, well, could we teach them a whole bunch? Could we make them better over time? The third is problem solving. Really interested in looking to see if a rep that we're interviewing or thinking about moving up is able to put together a solution that makes sense for a prospect and connect the dots. So if you've understood what's going on in that prospect's business, can you then recommend a solution as though you were a consultant for that business or you work there? Work ethic and being goal-oriented, I also find, are kind of like these intrinsically motivated people. If you're very high in these areas, then you're going to reach higher than the average rep. And when things get hard, you're going to be resilient and be able to bounce back. Again, like it's always, do they have these traits? And then can we teach them the skills and the competencies if they didn't walk in with them already set?
Yeah.
And Alex, because that was a lot. I can talk about skills, but what do you think of the traits?
I think go ahead, Alex.
No, go for it, man.
Yeah, totally agree. Like there's can we bring them in, and then there's core competencies that you can teach people later. And I think it's probably more of the same, but the only one I would add is like resourcefulness, because a lot of sales organizations, they move very quickly. Most of us are working remote with dispersed teams. And so like that ability to attempt to answer questions on their own before they, throw it in Slack or come to their manager, and speaking about how many resources you have for your team. Just making sure that like, hey, they'll take advantage of it. So like the new marketing campaign that Demand Gen just launched, they're going to take the time to read the email and then implement it immediately. Because I feel like those folks, when they've got a lot of at-bats and they're trying things constantly, we just tend to see a lot of improvement early on.
I love that one, especially in like these really fast-moving organizations where everything's changing weekly, monthly, quarterly. If you're not resourceful, you're going to get left behind. And people that come in behind you will catch up faster. That's a really good one. I need to add that.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because a lot of enablement organizations get trapped into this situation where they feel like they have to constantly send out information to salespeople. And then sometimes they make it difficult for them to find those nuggets of information that will help them really to be really successsul. So, so they've got to be very thoughtful about how salespeople have access to resources. So they know what to use and when to use them.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, like speaking about resourcefulness, it doesn't just mean like using the things that are sent to you, but we talk a lot at Outreach about making sure people know how to check their own data. So like putting them in the driver's seat, like their head of sales or their head of sales development might be like, what are the things that they're going to look for? Like, hey, if your sal rate is below this threshold, what might that mean? If you're not booking meetings on the phone, what dispositions are you using most often? So that when you come to your manager and you say, I need help, that's a great first step. But being a bit more driven of like, I need help talking to sales leaders. I'm great with marketers, but sales leaders at this level, I flounder with. And then it's like we can get really prescriptive with coaching.
So it's identifying as an individual what the things are that you need help with, not just relying on somebody else to tell you what's wrong.
Yeah, I guess it's just being process driven too.
That's pretty cool. All right, anybody want to add anything else here, or shall we move on?
I can, because I'm really interested in what everyone thinks about these. I'll hit on the skills and competencies that line up with the traits that I mentioned.
That'd be great.
Wonder what you think. So I had on my list product and market knowledge, understanding your buyer and how your solution fits in for them, presentation skills, practice and preparation, and how you position the value of your solution and create a business case is the list that we're working with right now as we look at sales readiness. But what would you add to that, or anyone who's in the audience as well? I'd love to hear from you too.
Yeah, add your comments in the chat. What do you think about consistency? As somebody in marketing, I care a lot about whether or not people are consistent with the message. Do you see that as an issue? Are people pretty consistent where you are? And how do you make sure that they're consistent? Or do you care about that?
We do check for it. It is really important, and especially in like these evolving markets with your brand, there's a lot that comes out of our enablement team and our product marketing team that supports us in that consistent messaging. I mean, consistency is one of my favorite words. I'm in sales management, so I love it no matter what. Right. But it does require a lot of call coaching. Like there's no other way to figure out if your team is doing it other than listening to the calls. And that doesn't mean riding along and being on every call, because then the reps get too dependent. But doing like true call reviews, film sessions, and giving feedback usually helps with that.
And he mentioned coachability. What do you guys think of that? I mean, is that an attribute of a sales rep that you look for when you hire that person, or how do you identify coachability?
Definitely coachability. To touch actually quickly on consistency, because I think that's a really good topic too, is that so most jobs, it's good to be consistent, and then especially in sales. One of the big challenges with that is that human beings are not consistent, right? So that's the challenge with running a sales team, where you need consistency. Some people wake up and they're in a good mood. Other times they wake up, they're not feeling like working. Some days they're feeling motivated. They read a quote on social media that got them going. So there can be all these variables, inputs that go into the consistency of somebody. And so that's where some of these outlying variables come into play, where you have to create good culture where people want to sell. You have to create a down-to-earth sales process that's repeatable and easy to digest and universal across your team. And so understanding that consistency is important. And then it's just important if you're in sales management to just follow up and ask that additional question, right? Which is what things need to be going into my team in order to create a culture where people want to come in every day to work, despite some of these other challenges that they're seeing to do that.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about consistency, of course, like we want it with our reps, but it also comes down to like your own operating rhythm as a manager. Like, do I have a consistent cadence for coaching people so that they know, hey, it's every other Tuesday I'm meeting with Brooke and we're going through my calls, and it doesn't feel ad hoc, and they know what they're going to be measured on. It just certainly helps a lot with like perfect practice.
Love that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, consistency, as a marketer, I think of consistency of message. But I think what you guys are talking about is consistency in your approach, and making sure that reps have that consistent cycle of things happening as part of their job, so that they can rely on them to be successful. Okay, anything else, or shall we move to the next? All right, so let me share my screen again. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Now, we've been talking, obviously, a lot about rep traits and what makes them successful. And, this is clearly an important conversation, especially for sales leaders like yourselves. And, if you think about the market, I've attended a lot of the analyst summits over the last few years, and analysts in particular, and I think everybody to some degree, is talking about the buyer's journey. And, what is it about a buyer that makes them likely to buy? So we've created these ideal customer profiles. They're used in demand gen. They're used to help salespeople prepare to, create personas and all these really important things. So we know, what industry is best to sell to, what size company, who are the personas that we sell to most successfully, and so on. But what about the seller, right? All that information about sellers is also extremely important. And these are some of the things we've already been talking about. The ideal rep profile, which is that combination of knowledge, skills, and behaviors that make salespeople successful, right? And so when we talk about an ideal rep profile, what we think about is the competencies and skills a rep must have to regularly close deals and meet or exceed quota. And, you think about it in a couple of different dimensions. There's that list of things that they need to know about, right? So they have to be able to do discovery, and they've got to articulate value. They've got to have good presentation skills. They've got to deliver the pitch consistently, handle objections, set trap-setting questions about competitors. All these important things that they've got to do, and also weighting them, right? Some of those things are way more important than others. The fact that they show up to work every day at whatever time you want them there is really important, but how they make use of their workday is way more important than that. And so, there's really kind of a methodology when you think about defining the ideal rep profile for your company, because every ideal rep profile is different. There are attributes, we have listed here, clear communicator, for example. And there are behaviors, the things that they do during their day, their deal velocity, their consistency with messaging, how much time they take allowing their buyers to talk, to them and tell them about what their issues are. And then how you measure those things. Is it, competitive mastery, product knowledge, whatever. So my question back for the group is, what are the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that you would include in your ideal rep profile? Keeping in mind that, all of you, obviously work at different companies, and those knowledge, skills, and behaviors are probably going to be slightly different. But having this conversation may, spark some thoughts from our audience about what would make them successful as well. So I'll turn it over to you. I think, Ross, you said you wanted to add some color to this conversation as well.
Sure. So there are definitely, I think, that are universal on this, right? There's some that you always want to check the boxes. So, an example of that would be, productivity and efficiency, right? There's just, I think it was on a webinar like this that I learned that's the number one thing. And you could teach them everything in the world and they could be as eager as they want, but if they're not going out there and actually doing it, then it doesn't have much of an impact. So that's the biggest one. But I want to actually just hone in on a few that I think will just be high impact for this meeting, and something that will give some of the other sales managers something to think about, and something that I've worked with my team on and seen success with. So the first one is reps' ability to create value after the demo. So a lot of times what happens is you have this really good conversation with the client, or not as good, and there's some set follow-up date in the future where you have this initial follow-up call, depending on your sales cycle. It could be a few weeks, it could be a few months, it could be a few days. The time that you're spending in between the demo and that follow-up call is actually really critical. And the messaging and the communication that you have is really important. I mean, it really speaks to your character and the way that you will approach the partnership if they do decide to move forward with your offering. And so one of the big things that I say to my team is respectful persistence, right? We want to continuously find ways to add value after the demo that keeps our product top of mind. Because the reality is, if they're true decision makers and stakeholders of these organizations, they have a million priorities and salespeople who are trying to leverage something all day long, right? Your pitch could have been one of 5 meetings that person was in where they had to consider whether or not they had to buy. So the question is, when that call ends and they're going back to their desk, or maybe they're work from home, they're going to a different Zoom meeting, how are you continuing to keep your product top of mind And how do you continuously remind them that your product is of value without being annoying about it? And that's actually a really important skill and a really important art. And it's something that you want to have pretty consistent conversations with your reps and teams on. And that's something that you really want to build up and something that you should be checking the box on for your ideal rep profile. So that's one of the big ones.
Ross, that's great. I'm just curious, from your perspective, how do you instruct or how do you coach your reps to do that, to stay respectfully engaged with their buyers after a demo?
Yeah. So the number one thing that I'd like to speak to is you want to be showing them things relevant to whatever it is that you offered without talking about the actual offering. So let's say you were trying to talk to them about, let's say you were selling them a branded page, right? And you're a marketing company and you want to help them with content and design, and they really like it, but they're super busy, and you have a follow-up in 2 weeks. Okay, what are you going to send them, right? There's a lot of things you could send. You could just send them a quick email saying, have a great weekend. You could send them an email just reminding them of all the great features. But what I like to advise is just, again, not talking about the product, but something that will help relate to it. So let's say you stumbled upon an article that said, companies who sign up for marketing pages see conversions of 50%, or check out these stats showing how much more revenue companies can generate with a marketing page. That isn't your product, but it's relevant, right? So maybe you want to be sending an email about that and saying, hey, look at where the industry is moving towards, right? We're seeing all these companies similar to yours see success with this type of offering. Anyway, I hope you have a great weekend. Looking forward to reconnecting. So something like that. There's a few ways that you can go about it, but that's one of the more successful ones we found.
Something and just a little substantive, so it doesn't look like it's a rote email just saying have a nice weekend and hey, remember I'm a nice guy.
Oh, 100, and it should teach them something. Yeah, they should take away something from that email other than a reminder that maybe you're a cool person.
Cool.
But it's being helpful beyond your own brand, so like that, to your point, the content doesn't have to be created by your company. It could be an article that someone else wrote about their industry or their competitors or anything that's relevant to them. But like, to add on to that, Ross, I think one other sort of like add-on skill to that is being able to then tie back what you're sharing with them in between sales steps to their specific goals and challenges. So you're always kind of reselling them. You're not talking about features in your product, but you are talking about what brought them to the table in the first place, so that they're always thinking about you as that sort of like trusted advisor as you share that content.
I remember attending a conference not too long ago where they, the presenter was talking about the fact that nobody cares about whether they bought from you. They care about whether they made the right decision. Mm-hmm. So if they see you as somebody who can help them make the right decision by adding information, by adding value to their decision-making process, can be a huge plus. I'm sorry, Brooke, I interrupted you.
No, you're fine. It's Zoom like, Yeah, so I think like what y'all are talking about is just the ability for somebody to connect the dots for their prospect or customer. And especially with like sales development roles, we talk a lot about that. And like you may hear a keyword, like if you're selling outreach, which is, engagement and intelligence software, and you hear, oh, somebody is using a CRM or they're using spreadsheets. It's like ding, 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 it goes off in my head and I immediately want to move to pitch. But you're calling this person out of the blue. Like you have to make sure that you're asking questions to help them connect the dots, so that when you do go to close, or like you do go to like make another ask, it's very clear and it doesn't feel like, popcorny sales cycle.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge that we all face is that every B2B buyer has lots and lots of salespeople who are hitting on them, and you've got to figure out a way to make it worth their while to communicate with you. And so, adding value in those little communications can be extremely important in the process.
Last point on that too, just what Brooke F had brought up around, you almost want to create the perception that you don't even work at a different company, right? Like you almost want to make it feel like you're sitting at the same table as them, weighing out these different options, right? So we have option A, which is, happens to be your company, and option B has these advantages and disadvantages. And we have option C, which is we keep doing what we're doing. And you want it to make it feel as though you're just helping them weigh the pros and cons, and you work at their organization and you're arriving at the conclusion that your offering is the best one. So I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah. Here's another question for you that pertains to this. one skill that I've seen, or one behavior, I guess is more appropriate to describe it, is that, you see salespeople who are working incredibly hard and they seem to be doing all the right things, but their deals don't close. And a lot of times it seems like the reason why is because they're focusing on accounts that are not likely to buy. I'm just curious, how do you work with your sales reps to make sure they're working with the right accounts, that, they're spending their time wisely?
Totally.
I can take it. No, you take it, Ross.
Okay,
Go.
cool. Yeah, that's a great question. The highest impact thing you can do as a sales manager is being in the field. So you need to have being in the field, like being on the calls with them. You need to have some understanding of what it's like to actually hear them talk and the way that they're actually having these interactions. Now, there's I can name a dozen things prior to that point. We all need to be, good with CRMs and managing, opportunities and pipeline, and having open conversations about what's happening to those. But where you gain the real insight as a manager or director of a sales team is when you're actually listening to them interact with a client. And it's usually from there that you can pick up on where it is that there might be any sort of disconnect. So this has been a trend that's declined over time. Actually, we've seen less people in sales management be out in the field and be on calls, but it actually remains to be some of the highest impact, and also gives you the credibility when you're coaching them because they know that you were there listening.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to talking about sales readiness. That doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a lot of cross-functional partnership that needs to happen to get there. So talking about prioritizing accounts, how tight are you with your RevOps team so you know that on the back end, you have indicators so I can actually, if I'm looking at my list of accounts, I know which buckets I'm working in first, and do those match what we're finding in the field? And then does enablement know how to help make sure that people are prioritizing? So it's definitely a team effort.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation, Brooke, that there's so much more sort of surround sound now around sales reps to make them successful. And part of that is data, but the rest of it is the teams to take the data and feed us some sort of insights to think about how we prioritize our accounts. And, I just think about how much bigger and more talented overall ops teams have become over time. And there's such a critical role for us as we think about, both sales ops, biz ops in general are pointing us in the right direction based on all of the data that we're pulling back over the course of the year, and we're refining our account strategy as a result of that. But it is kind of on the reps at the end of the day to make sure that with that information that they have, they're doing the work of prioritizing the accounts so they can spend their time in the right places, and managers need to inspect that and make sure it's happening and support them.
That's right. And, one of the challenges, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, one of the challenges that managers face, especially, as companies get larger, is how you can do that at scale, right? Because you have lots of companies and sometimes you have lots of managers, but, your days, I'm sure, are full of different things that you're doing. So how can you make sure that you're paying attention to those different sales reps and what they're doing individually? And while I agree, Ross, that being on as many calls as you can is critical, sometimes as a practical matter, you can't be on as many as you'd like to be. And so, that's where I think there is technology out there. Obviously, conversation intelligence, for example. I guess I'm shilling a little bit from Mind Tickle here, but there are ways that you can do that that enable you to do some of that, fly on the wall activity at scale. So, there are options, but it is really important to know what your reps are doing out in the field, because how they spend their time, regardless of their intentions, is obviously incredibly important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think when you roll out trainings too, if you make any kind of change, or even when people are starting in boot camp, we refer to it as taking an awareness, competency, and mastery approach to learning. So in boot camp, my job is to make sure that everyone is aware how they are measured and where to go find things when they have questions. Then they leave my camp and then they go to their frontline managers who help them become competent. So all right, you're not going to be batting 1,000 all the time, but we'll help you work on things with the end goal that they will have mastered that skill. And I think if we didn't take that into account, I would be trying to cram a bunch of information into somebody's brain, and then they would be in the field and lose it all, and then we'd just be playing plugging the holes, or whack-a-mole, trying to fix individual skills instead of working them along sequentially.
Yeah.
We try to sort of split up skills that are individual focused versus the ones that we're seeing common threads across the entire team, where we can do group training, group reinforcement. But in terms of the individual skills, and I tend to agree with you, Alex, that it's not scalable to be on every call with every rep, especially if you're building up a pretty big team. Like, eventually you're going to run out of hours in the day. And the second challenge is with some reps, it can create too much dependency. That doesn't mean don't ever jump on calls, definitely do. But if you sprinkle in the call coaching with that, and there are ways to do that, which, is probably another meeting for another day, you can start to pull out individual skills that tie back to their sales funnel metrics. So where rep A is falling off might be very different from where rep B is falling off. And then you can start to pick the skills out of your list of what you know is important to be successful in this role and do very tactical coaching around that for a period of time. And if you need it, you can pull in additional resources from enablement, so on and so forth. But I found that's a more scalable way to do individual skill coaching at scale.
Yeah, and I'm probably jumping ahead a little bit of myself, but I talk about this sometimes that, let's say you have two salespeople you hire at a company. One is an incredibly successful salesperson who comes from somewhere else and doesn't know anything about, what you do or what you sell. And then you have another person who is a product expert from your company who is now going into sales. Obviously, those people have to be enabled and coached and just looked at in different ways. And so that ability to understand where the common threads are, as you were referring to, Brooke, and where those needs for individual attention those are really important to help make each person successful. And so with that, if it's okay, I'm going to move on and go back to our slideshow, just so we can go on to the next topic. There we go. You guys can see my screen, right? So I just want to mention very briefly that I talked about the difference between enablement and readiness. And one of the huge differences between these two, and there are a bunch of points on this slide, but I wanted to focus on this one in particular, is that when you talk about readiness, particularly, easy for me to say, particularly with ideal rep profiles, what you're doing is you're creating the ability to have benchmarks that you can measure enablement activities against. Traditionally, enablement has often focused on adoption, right? And so a lot of people are taking enablement, we're enabling all the right stakeholders, so we're successful. But now, once you're able to introduce metrics against which you can, analyze that enablement, now you can focus on what are the winning behaviors that make people successful, and then you can use those metrics to evaluate the success of your enablement programs. So just to change topic and talk about that a little bit, how do you measure individual performance against ideal rep profiles? And I'll take it back to the panel, and whoever wants to answer that first would be great.
I take a look at, on a monthly and quarterly basis, like inputs and outputs. We're looking at quota attainment, close rates, pipeline built, a few other metrics, a few other conversion rate metrics, like how many of your discovery calls go to demo, where do they drop off in your funnel? And then we try to track those back. But we do that monthly or quarterly. I hope I explained that well, but.
No, that's great. And here's the biggest challenge with ideal rep profiles. Like what you described there is, I think those are primarily, let's describe them as activity-based metrics, mm-hmm. And those are totally legitimate. And I think what a lot of sales managers have to use to measure against. I'm just curious, do you have an idea? Hey, this person does really good discovery, and this person doesn't. I mean, do you sort of, even if it's not measurable, do you have some intuition about sort of that subset of skills that makes somebody a little bit more successful than somebody else, and how that shows up on, at the end of the month when you see what the revenues are?
I mean, I think that it does always go back to the data. You have to listen to the calls as well and sort of like check it against your data. But let's say that you have a rep that, only ran 5 discoveries but closed 4 deals. and then you have a rep that ran, 10 discoveries and closed one deal, who runs a better discovery?
Yeah,
Or maybe you could pull it back even more and they never even get to demo, but they're a really great fit account. So maybe something about that discovery is falling off because, to kind of go back to my traits list, your rep, you didn't test very well to make sure that they were curious. So they weren't actively listening and asking great questions and connecting the dots. Or, maybe they aren't a great problem solver, so they can't clearly articulate at the end of that discovery exactly what I heard your problem is, how I'm going to help you, and how I'm going to do it with what my solution is. And so, but I'm always checking that against the numbers, because otherwise it's just my gut. And it's not that I don't love my gut, but I have to check it.
totally understood. And Ross, I'm actually really interested in your input on this, because you talked about, and we were just talking about discovery, you talked about how some people ask really engaged discovery questions and some people are sort of reading from a list. Is there a way for you to, on a numbers basis, use metrics to make an evaluation aside from being there to listen to those calls?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, there's different ways that you can sort of quantify these skills, and just to break it down in a similar way, in terms of ideal rep profile. So obviously we have our quota, and you have a team, and you have to get to the quota, and then you have this playbook, which is the ideal rep profile, which is this list of skills and competencies and behaviors that if everybody on your team had mastered, everybody would hit their quota all the time, right? So that we have to operate under that assumption. So then the challenge becomes, okay, so we have this list. Not everybody has mastered all these skills, right? Then the next question is we don't know who hasn't mastered what skill. So how do we uncover that and figure that out? Whether it's this person is not good with questions, this person's not good with handling objections. How do you uncover that? Well, this is where creativity really comes in as a manager. And this is really where you have to be innovative and think a little bit outside the box. You want to be able to uncover these things and have a good idea of who's good at what. So I'll just give you a few examples of how you can do this. Let's say one on your ideal rep profile is strong email communication, right? And you just know that is really a key thing to move through the sales cycle. Mm-hmm. What can you do about that? Well, one example is you could have email workshops where a few times a week you give your team an email scenario where a client is giving an objection or hesitation, and on the spot you give them 5 to 10 minutes. They have to reply to that email. Mm-hmm. And then individually, one-on-one, you go over what it is that's in the email and what's not in the email. I'll give another example. Role plays, right? Where you have one AE or rep pitching to another, and you're listening and you're hearing how they handle the objections. Mm-hmm. So there's all this information and knowledge that you're uncovering through these activities that you can then coach to individually. So you see what the email is and you bring it up to them at a one-on-one meeting, and you go over some of those mechanics and some of those to-dos, and then you measure it based on some of the changes that you're seeing in their emails a few weeks later. So you set the benchmarks, how much time do I want to give them to adapt to the new coaching? And then you want to set, well, what are the things that I'm having them adapt to? And so if you have those two variables, if you have a playbook as how to actually elicit this behavior to then learn what they need, then you're going to start to see them move up into the right.
Now that's great, Ross. And Brooke, as the sales enablement practitioner, I'd love to get your input on this as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think what y'all are pointing out is just the importance of making sure people know how they're being scored and where can they check the scoreboard. So if you back that into okay, the mechanics of how am I measuring this team? Yes, ideal situations is I can listen to every single call, but we don't have time for that. So you can use, like Alex mentioned, conversational intelligence or other reporting to track that. And it could be as simple as for SDRs, do I have clear call dispositions that just say, instead of meeting booked yay or nay, was it the intro that I got stuck on? Was it the objection handling that I got stuck on? Was it the close that I got stuck on? So then if we're looking for trends like Brooke S called out, I can see, is this isolated to one person or is it a holistic team issue? And for closers, it's close loss reasons. If it's just wasn't a priority, bad timing, etc. If you can get, you don't want to make it to be too nitty gritty. But if you have break it into categories, then you can go fix things later. So it's very much letting people know early on how they're going to be measured, and then having the foresight to say, here's what I'm going to go check in a month to see if it's working well.
Question for you, Brooke. Do you do you certify your reps when they come out of your boot camp onboarding? Are they getting some sort of a certification on each of the skills or competencies that you've identified?
We're not quite there yet. I think certification can be a big scary word if we're doing like formal certification, but like definitely around badging. And one thing that we have implemented for this year is like we call it the golden demo. Like you should be able to tell the story of outreach, and there's 3 pillars, and here's the problems that we solve. Like in your sleep by the time you leave boot camp, and we do use an LMS to track that and grade it. So very early stages, but I think it's awesome if you're already at a point where you've got multiple badging checkpoints throughout their career.
Yeah, there's a thing about certifications, which I think they're obviously valuable, is that the proof is in the pudding, right? They can be certified, but then they have to prove it when they go out in the field, and being able to understand how they perform when they're in the field is extremely important. And that's I think a lot of it stymies a lot of sales enablement organizations because they think they've done a good job, but I've known plenty of reps in my career who were really good at training. But then they go out in the field and you don't see the results that you expect from them, and that can be frustrating for everybody. So as we get closer to time, I just want to make sure that we hit all of the key topics. So I'm going to share my screen one more time, and then we will move on. So there we go. So it's funny, Ross, you were talking about this concept of role plays and coaching and things like that. And it's really critical in organizations. And nobody, if you ask salespeople to raise their hand if they like role plays, I don't think anybody is going to tell you that that's the favorite thing they need to, that they like to do. But on the other hand, it really is a good indicator to make sure that they've not only understood the things that they need to do, but actually practice those things so they can use them when money's on the line effectively. So we talk about identifying rep knowledge gaps at scale, so we can figure out, hey, what's working and what isn't, and then delivering individualized training and coaching, and then being able to continuously measure the skill development and field applications to ensure close alignment with this ideal rep profile. But the key thing is being able to understand at scale what's going on, and then individualize the way that you address those areas in need of remediation. And then finally, as I was just talking about, analyzing skills and competencies against business metrics like pipeline creation and win rates. And so the last question I have for you guys, or at least the last major question, is how does your organization train and coach based on individual skill gaps? We've talked about this a little bit, but do you guys have a methodology or a formula, if not on an organizational level, on an individual level, that wins for you, that you try to repeat as much as possible with your reps? And with that, I'll stop sharing and see what you guys have to say.
I think for us, and this is true at Drift and at previous companies, we're tying in a lot of the concepts that we've talked about throughout this conversation, like even at a very baseline level, certifying your new reps as they come out of training. And it's not fancy. I would love to get to a place where it's like souped up, but right now it's just like, can they show that they know these individual skills, and we've sort of like check that box for them before they hit the floor. I think 2 is the consistent operating rhythm that you talked about, Brooke, where like the rep knows that they're doing call coaching on Tuesdays, they're doing, group film review on Thursdays, if they're doing deal reviews with their manager on Fridays, and all of those activities combined help us get a picture of where they might need extra help. And then we commit to picking one skill at a time, because most reps can't get better at more than one thing at a time and do a very good job. So we pick one thing that they can work on. And Ross, that goes back to your notion of role plays and like real creative activities that we can do together to get better, practicing with the emails, like as long as you know what the skill is that you're trying to coach to, and using the data to support why you're coaching to it.
That's great, Brooke. And actually, I seem to be going clockwise in my Zoom and asking Ross after you talk, Brooke. So I'm going to go counterclockwise and ask Brooke B this question, especially since you're on the enablement side, coaching is often thought of as something that, the frontline sales manager does. I'm just curious, do you participate in the coaching process, or do you provide resources for frontline sales managers to do coaching? How does that work in your organization?
Yeah, I think it's a great question and certainly a hot topic. With the growth of enablement, I think, at least from our own perspective, we're kind of in a spot where we're all learning, like, how do we best leverage this resource as a team? And I'm of the mindset that coaching really should be done on the manager level, right? Not only is you're building a relationship, but you're on the boots on the ground person, like, like how to help this person. You have that relationship with them. On my side, what I can do is help make sure that they have frameworks in place to coach effectively and to standardize coaching across the teams. That if I go to Ross, I get the same answer as I would if I went to Brooke. So part of that is like enablement role. It's a rollout, we call manager reinforcement framework. So we use the Kirkpatrick model of, like, before a training, does everybody know what we're doing? We're going to survey people afterwards to make sure that they understood what was covered. There's going to be some kind of test. The managers know what they're going to cover in their one-on-ones. We call it like a meeting in a box. So giving them questions they ask reps in one-on-ones, questions they ask in a huddle, what kind of activities they're going to have after the fact, and then making sure, always starting with the end in mind, what report am I going to check to see, was this training worth the time and did it get what we needed to be done? So to wrap that up, I see enablement's role not necessarily to do the individual coaching, although it's very fun and I love doing it, but to provide standardized frameworks so that really when change management gets rolled out, everyone's on the same page.
So what I've seen a lot in practice is that frontline managers do a lot of deal coaching, and deal coaching is essential in many instances because you need to close that business to make your number. But Ross, I'm curious, if you were to evaluate how much deal coaching versus skills coaching you do in the organization, what do you think the balance is there?
Yeah, great question. You have to do both. So a few things to point out just on this topic broadly. One is, in terms of coaching individually, it's important to do that. I think there's a lot of cases where, the team meeting that's the end of the coaching for that director or that manager, right? And that's just not the best approach. If you've ever sat in a classroom with other students and you're lost, right? It's hard to just suddenly pick up the pieces again, right? So you need somebody to come in and give you that individualized coaching. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, I guess I'll touch on two quick things. One is you want to teach as a group and then reinforce individually, right? So if you're doing a thing on objection handling, rather than coaching 11 different individuals on objection handling, have them in a meeting for 30 minutes or whatever it is and give them the core principles and do some role plays and give some bullet points. Then in your one-on-ones or at a later session, talk about it, right? Ask if they have any questions about the meeting that they had just had. And what you'll find when you ask that question is a lot of times they have a million questions, or they were confused about a particular part that would have prevented them from actually trying it. Similar to sales in general, clients won't buy unless they see the value in it. So too will reps not implement if they don't see the value in your coaching. So you need to follow up with that individualized reinforcement questions.
That's really helpful. So we are 2 minutes away from the top of the hour, and I just would ask is there anything else that any of the panelists would like to add to this conversation? It's been a really awesome, really free-flowing conversation. I think a lot of good points have been made. But given the short amount of time we have between now and the time we have to wrap up, anything else anybody want to add about their experiences, the IRP, how they might take some of these learnings from what we've talked about over the last hour and sort of apply them in their own org?
My last thought on it is that it's just so important to get this right at the beginning when a rep first comes out of training. Usually you can catch the gaps early, and the quicker you can coach to them, the quicker you can ramp them. And nothing's worse than a slow ramp for the rep and for the company. So that's my final thought on it is start early and don't wait on the reps to get deep into ramp.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really important. You want them, and not only is starting really important from the perspective of, helping them be successful right away, but you're making a cultural statement. This is something we're going to do all the time.
Yep.
And I think people will get used to it and just be infused as part of what you do every day. All right, well, we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank all of you. It was an awesome session. I greatly appreciate your participation. I hope you and the audience were able to get a lot out of it as well. I certainly did. And I hope we have an opportunity to engage in another panel down the road.
Love
So,
to.
Thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Russ.
Everyone.
Thanks. Have a good one.